evening, everyone. Welcome to the book launch event this evening. We are happy to present Dr. Harini Nagendra's new book, Nature in the City, Bangalore, in the Present, Past, and Future. In a rapidly urbanizing India, what is the future of nature conservation? How does the march of development impact the conflict between nature and people in India's cities? Exploring these questions, Nature in the City examines the past, present, and future of nature in Bengaluru, one of India's largest and fastest growing cities. Once known as the Garden City of India, Bengaluru's tree-lined avenues, historic parks, and expansive water bodies have witnessed immense degradation and destruction in recent years, but also shown remarkable tenacity for survival. This book charts Bengaluru's journey from the early settlements of 16th century CE to the 21st century city, and demonstrates how nature has looked, behaved, and been perceived in Bengaluru's home gardens, slums, streets, parks, sacred places, and lakes. A fascinating narrative of the changing role and state of the nature in the midst of urban sprawl and integrating research with stories of people and places, this book presents an accessible and informative story of the city where nature thrives and strives. We are delighted and honored to have Dr. Ramchandra Guha and Mr. Girish Karnad here to release the book. I now request Dr. Sugata Ghosh, Director, Global Academic Publishing, Oxford University Press, India, to give the publisher's introduction and hand over the copies to Dr. Guha and Mr. Karnad for the formal release.
Dr. Karnad, Dr. Guhar, Dr. Nagendra, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. On behalf of Oxford University Press, I sincerely welcome you to the launch of Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present, and Future. As a department of the University of Oxford, we believe in furthering the university's objective of excellence in research, scholarship, and education by publishing worldwide and in different formats. Our diverse and eminent publishing program includes scholarly works in a wide variety of academic disciplines, and the study of sustainability is one of the new and core areas that we are focusing on. This program is continuously evolving, pushing the boundaries towards new interpretations and research. A welcome addition and a great one to this list globally is Nature in the City by Dr. Harini Nagendra. It comes at a time when we are questioning the future of nature conservation in a rapidly urbanizing India. Authored by Harini Nagendra, Professor of Sustainability at the Azim Premji University, this book is a fascinating narrative of the changing role and state of nature in the midst of urban sprawl. Integrating research with stories of people and places, it presents an accessible and informative story of a city where nature thrives but also strives. We are delighted to have two acclaimed and great Bengalurians here this evening with us. Ramchandra Guha, historian, biographer, cricket writer, commentator, public intellectual, whose books also include fantastic environmental histories that Oxford University Press published. And we also have Dr. Karnad, playwright, filmmaker, actor of great repute. And last but not the least, each one of you who have taken your time out on a Friday evening and make yourselves available here. Thank you once again very much. May I now request Dr. Karnad and Dr. Guha to kindly release the book. Harini.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is yours. Thank you.
I now request Mr. Girish Karnad to share his thoughts on the book. Thank you, sir. Yeah, please.
Good evening, everyone. I need scarcely say how delighted I was when Harini Nagendra asked me to be here to the launch of this book because, like all of you, I'm a Bangalorean. I love Bangalore, and I have a whole shelf full of books on Bangalore. Every book on Bangalore that has appeared, I have kept there, and this is one of them. So I thought, well, even if I had not been invited here to release it, I would have bought a copy. But anyway, it's nice to have an inscribed copy by the author. And now that I have read the book, let me say that it's it's the best of the books, simply because it takes you through the whole history. Usually when one talks of Bangalore 20 years ago or 200 years ago, back to the time the British came, Tipu Sultan, Lal Bagh, all that. But this book takes you right back to the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries when Bangalore was a village, and it's fascinating to see what it went through, all the transformations that the landscape went through. We think of Bangalore as a green city, as a city of parks, as a city of trees and so on, but it's amazing for how many centuries it was really a rocky landscape. I won't go into all that because this book is really about that, and it's marvelous to be here. While I'm on the subject, let me compliment Oxford on this cover and the production. It's a beautiful book, really. I have a particular bone to pick with Oxford because I'm an Oxford author, and every time there is a cover, I fight with them. And I said, no, I don't like this cover. Please change it. Put another photograph. So when I saw Harini's invitation, I said, why are they partial to her and not to me? I mean, why it's such a beautiful cover, and it's nice. It'll have pride of place on my shelf, in all those books on Bangalore. The second reason why I'm very delighted to be here is that not only Harini Nagendra, but her entire Nagendra family are our neighbors. We have been together, and this particular title, Nature in the City, virtually sums up how we became neighbors. Because I will tell you a little anecdote of how what happened is in 1880s, we had just come to Bangalore for the education of our children. We didn't know where to stay. We were looking at all possible areas, and my wife, Saraswati, and my daughter, Radha, were walking down the road in JP Nagar. In those days, it was known really as Saraki and so on. And when they were walking down, they saw this tree, this beautiful rain tree bending down like a hokusai painting, because of the wind and so on and so on. And we thought, what a marvelous tree. I mean, I didn't think they thought. They came and told me there's this beautiful tree and there's this lovely plot, and they were set on building our house there. We came, saw it there. I came and saw it, and then we built a house right under the tree so that the terrace of our house would be under the tree. So in fact, nature in that part of the city is part of our relationship. Although the tree was not in our garden or their garden, it was outside on the main road, which was unfortunate because as soon as the BBMP decided to widen the road, they took down the tree. Now, in that sense, what has happened to our neighborhood, their neighborhood and our neighborhood, is in fact the theme of this book. It tells you how Bangalore has changed continuously, how it has transformed itself and transformed the people. Now, when we built the house, we had a 50-foot road right across. Now there is an underpass to allow for traffic, and the whole argument seems to be that the city is not for people who live in the city, but people who drive in the city. Because, and so on. I mean, there are various arguments to do that. But anyway, the fact is that we are bound by the nature that's common to us, to their garden. Today, if you look, the tree is gone, all the other trees are gone, or the buildings have come up where there were houses. In fact, when we were building our house, I dropped in there, met her father, and her father said, Mr. Karnad, how nice to have you here. Now we feel more secure. You know, because theirs was the only house, and then there were gaps on either side. That was what JP Nagar was like in 1880s, late 1880s, early 90s. And how it has transformed itself is that now ours are the only two gardens which have trees in it, because everything else is gone. The whole this has changed. The third point, which of course not strictly relevant, but which I'm reminded of, is that is the number of people, the friends, relations of theirs that I met outside. And Harini said, and Anjana, her sister, said, these are all old Bangaloreans. And I said, how nice to meet old Bangaloreans, because there is no old Bangalore left anymore. I mean, it's, you know. And I will end by just mentioning one little anecdote about old Bangalore, because, you know, Bangalore is called, the story, apocryphal story perhaps, is that Bengaluru comes from the name Bendakalu on, you know, Bendakalu Uru, which is that one of the kings went hunting, he got lost, and an old woman gave him Bendakalu, boiled beans on, you know, to eat on a roti, and he survived, and he built the house there, and it became Bendakalu and so on. In fact, I have a play. I mean, Bengaluru possesses you, and I have a play called Bendakalu on Toast, because that's what's happened to Bangalore, you know. When the king came here, whenever 3rd, 4th, 5th century, he got the Bendakalu on roti, you know. But today you get it on toast, like baked beans on toast. You don't get baked beans, you get Benda beans, you can say, if you like. And I remembered that the very first day I came to Bangalore, in 1963, I had come to attend the wedding of the brother of Professor A.K. Ramanujan, the great scholar, and she was getting married in Malleshwaram somewhere. And I came by car with a friend who had lots of punctures and so on and so on. Ultimately, we reached Bangalore at about 2 in the morning. And in those days, Bangalore had almost no electricity. It was all in the dark. There were no hotels. We didn't know where to go. And we wandered around. We couldn't see any hotels. And ultimately, I saw in Malleshwaram a light in a door. And I said to my driver, let's wait. Let's go and see. Ask them, madam. So I went and knocked on the door. And I said, an old man opened the door. And I said, look, we're lost. Can you tell us how to get to the Kalyana Mandapa, somewhere here? And he said, he said, you can't go to a Kalyana Mandapa at 2 in the morning. You sleep here, he said. And, you know, he opened the door and he spread out 2 mats and gave pillows. And it really was, it was not Bendakalu, but it was as much warmth. It was the same kind of hospitality that one felt after 1,000 years. Now, while Bangalore has changed, I don't know whether anyone would open the doors at 2 in the morning to completely unknown strangers, let them in and let them sleep in, you know, in the front yard of their house. Well, anyway, let me say again, what a great pleasure it's been to be, what's a great pleasure to be here, to be associated with a book from the Nagendra family and written by Harini, and to meet you all this evening. I wish the book and I wish Oxford all success with it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I now request Dr. Ramchandra Guha to say a few words about the book.
Bengaluru is a city of extraordinary cultural and linguistic diversity. Some years ago, when there was a movement by Kannada filmmakers and producers to ban the screening of films made in other languages, particularly Hindi, for a period of 6 weeks before they were released elsewhere in the country. And with his characteristic courage and integrity, Girish Karnad, himself a Kannada filmmaker, opposed that ban. At that stage, I got a call from a friend in Hyderabad, in anguish, saying, what is all this parochialism? He said, He said, Bangalore is the only city in the world in which you have daily film shows in 6 languages, the 4 southern languages, Hindi and English. And of course, that cultural, linguistic, religious, ethnic diversity is represented in this room. It's represented on the stage. The author is a Kannada speaker. Girish is a great Kannada writer whose mother tongue is actually Konkani. And I'm a Tamil. Now, I'm a Tamil from Bangalore, which is a little bit like being a Gujarati from Mumbai. You think you're from the city, but some chaps tell you you're not from the city. I'm a 4th generation Tamil. I don't know when Harini's 4th generation Tamil from Bangalore. My great-grandfather moved here. I don't know how long Harini's family has been here. But I was delighted to discover 2 minutes ago that although I'm much younger than Girish, my first visit to Bangalore was before his. I came here first. We are Kannadigas from Tamil Nadu. From Tamil Nadu, lovely, lovely. That's even better. So I first came here in 1959. I was a child of 1, and my mother brought me here to display me to the grandparents. Now, this cultural, linguistic, religious diversity of Bengaluru is, of course, something to glory in and has been studied about, written about. But the ecological diversity of Bangalore/Bengaluru has awaited its historian, its chronicler, its scientist, till Harini's wonderful book appeared. And I'll say a little bit about Harini's book later on, and I'll explain or enumerate 5 reasons to praise the book and to welcome the book. But I'll begin with a remark of Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi said many extraordinary things, some stupid things, some things which were both extraordinary and turned out to be less than intelligent. One of the statements was in the last category, which was true, insightful, but also perhaps counterproductive, was a remark of Gandhi that all of you will be aware of, where he said, India lives in her villages. India lives in her villages, all 700,000 of them. And largely true. At the time he made that remark, maybe 80% of India lived in its villages. The intellectuals are mostly from the cities. He was urging the scientists, the intellectuals, the activists to go outside where they lived and to look at the problems of the peasants, the artisans, the pastoralists, the fisherfolk. But India has always lived in its cities. India has always been a great urban civilization. Think of Indraprastha, for example. Think of Kurukshetra, think of Ayodhya, think of Delhi, think of Hyderabad. And well before the British came, we were a great urban civilization. And of course now, we are moving more and more towards the cities. But Gandhi's remark, India lives in her villages, was responsible for a situation whereby environmental, indirectly, I don't want to blame Gandhi because we are free to reject Gandhi, but many of us didn't. And in the 1970s and 80s, when the environmental movement started in India, it was oriented towards the countryside. So the first major environmental struggle was the Chipko Andolan, which was of peasants in the Himalaya. This was followed by the Kerala fisherfolk struggle, and the Narmada Andolan of tribals protesting a large dam. So the theater of environmental activism was in the countryside, in and around the villages. And environmental scholars like myself followed the activists away from the cities where we were into the countryside. And the discipline of environmental history, with which I am most familiar, but also the discipline of environmental sociology, environmental anthropology, was all about forests, water, grazing lands. It was all about rural issues. And I once remarked that the Indian environment debate is an argument in the city about what is happening in the countryside. That was the situation and remains the situation for a very long time. There's an anti-urban bias in environmental activism and scholarship. Part of it legitimate, because a majority of Indians still live in the countryside. Legitimate because the colossal damage caused by urban industrial ways of life are invisible to us, but they're visible in the countryside. When Bangalore draws its water from 100 miles away, it's people living in and around the Kaveri who feel the pinch of all of that. When, shall we say, the tanneries of Kanpur pollute the Ganga. It's the villages downstream who suffer because of that. But this anti-urban bias of activism and scholarship was perhaps excessive. It went on too long. And the first reason to welcome Harini's book is that it challenges this. It's the first scholarly study of, as it were, nature in the city. It's the first, at least to my knowledge. There have been partial studies, there have been some good works on pollution by scientists, some reasonably competent studies of waste disposal. But this is the first proper ecological work on a city, socio-ecological work on a city. Like that's the first reason to welcome it, that it goes against the grain of the anti-urban bias of environmental activism and scholarship, a bias made more painful every day by the fact that more and more Indians are moving to the cities, and soon, if not already, we will have the largest urban population in the world. The second reason to welcome Harini's book is that it is superbly researched. It is genuinely interdisciplinary. It brings in perspectives from both the natural and the social sciences, and is based on years of careful and systematic empirical research. And research that shows her intimacy with almost every part of the city. She's walked through the city, which is how you understand the city. And of course, it also has a very long historical sweep, which Girish has talked about, from the geological past to the early settlements to the pre-modern rulers onto the British and beyond. So that's the second reason to welcome it. It's a properly interdisciplinary study. Though she was trained as an ecologist, she's a self-trained social scientist and anthropologist in the best possible way. It's impossible to go the other way. It's impossible for a historian like me to become a physicist. I'm too stupid and I'm too old. But at any stage, someone trained in the natural sciences, who is willing to unlearn some of the biases of the natural sciences, who's willing to understand that careful research in the social sciences is not only about numbers and equations, but about empathy and understanding and fieldwork and immersion in the communities you're studying. And that's the kind of transition Harini has made while retaining her scientific background. So it's got scientific rigor and rich fieldwork experience. So it's a properly interdisciplinary study. The third reason to welcome Harini's book is that it covers all parts and all landscapes of a very spread out and socially diverse city. So it's about the Pete and the cantonment, the new suburbs and the old slums. So it's extremely sensitive to the social and ecological diversity of the city. And of course to the different, so to say, ecoscapes. So it's about trees, gardens, parks, and lakes. And not only about the ecological functions of trees, parks, gardens, and lakes, but their social and economic functions too. So the interdisciplinary aspect, thrust of the study, which is very seamless. So you have to look at the world as a whole. And you look at the natural and the social world as a whole, and you look at the interrelationships in a kind of almost, as she has done it, not in an in-your-face way, in a kind of effortless, seamless, almost organic way, because of the years of study and reflection that have gone into the book. And when speaking of the kind of scope of the book, what is particularly struck by the sensitivity to the city's poorer communities, which is a real hallmark of the book. It's not only about people like all of us here. Some of the best sections actually deal with new slums, the expansion of the city, the impact on the poorer and more vulnerable populations. That's the third reason to welcome it, that it covers all parts of the city. The fourth reason to welcome it is something that Girish has flagged, is the quality of its presentation, its skillful use of maps, figures, photos, and also that the writing is so clear and lucid. And I'm going to read you just a passage of the book. Hopefully Harini will read some more passages, and hopefully she will choose a passage I'm not choosing here. But even if she doesn't, the passage I'm reading to you is extremely representative of the kind of quality of the prose. And the attention to detail and the extremely keen and sensitive eye of the person writing this. Now, this is from a chapter called Nature in Personal Spaces, Home Gardens in Bengaluru. And she starts the chapter by talking about bungalows. Now, that's what Bangalore, at least the cantonment, not so much the Pete, was famous for. You know, you had an old bungalow with an acre and a half of garden. I live in a bungalow which belonged originally to a British gentleman who sold it to my wife's grandfather. And it's one of many bungalows in that part of the cantonment in which the owners claim, and my wife also claims, that Churchill lived there, once lived there. Maybe all of them should go and pay his unpaid bills in the Bangalore Club. But there are about 100 such bungalows. But it was set in about an acre and a half of garden. Some of them still remain. So that's the kind of typical Bangalore that a middle class, upper middle class person would associate with the Bangalore that's being lost. Right? An old British bungalow with a garden and fruit trees and some space for the kids to play and so on. But what is striking about Harini's account is she moves from those bungalows to the smaller home gardens. As she says, other home gardens are smaller, with a tiny cottage or home nestled against the wall on one side and a seemingly wild profusion of plants on either side of the narrow pathway that goes from the gate to the wall. A pathway just wide enough for one large person or for the scooter that is commonly found at the end of the path. The plants here are just as carefully tended, but the emphasis is on a different kind of aesthetic from the large bungalows of the elite. Here, in the smaller home gardens, one is apt to find a small patch of greens like spinach, coriander, and mint, next to another patch with tubers such as ginger, turmeric, and radish, a makeshift arrangement of sticks that has been constructed to support brinjal and tomato plants. No kitchen garden in Bangalore is complete without a chili plant, a curry leaf bush, and, depending on the religious beliefs of the residents, a tulsi plant. Even the gate is not spared and is often used as a trellis support on which to grow creepers that provide beans and lentils. The aesthetic is not taken over wholly by the culinary, however, far from it. Some gardens contain a rose bush or two, a marigold, a jasmine, or a hibiscus, all tended with the same loving care that the vegetables receive. So this is sort of you can see how carefully and sensitively that home garden has been delineated, where the social and the natural blend so beautifully. And that's a characteristic of the book. So I gave you 4 reasons, which I'll enumerate. This is the first serious study, so far as I know, of nature in the city. Second, that is properly and rigorously interdisciplinary. Third, that it covers all parts of very spread out and diverse city, both in terms of natural diversity and social diversity. Fourth is the quality of the writing and the presentation. And the fifth reason to welcome Harini's book, and I think this is, she's very, obviously her style is very different from mine or from Girish's. Harini is not the kind of person who gets into controversies. Right, Girish? Do you think that? I don't know. So, she's not likely, she's not likely to have death threats on Twitter or a police guard posted outside her house, right? So, she's a scholar. She's not a writer who says, So, but I think one of the, apart from the work, which is so deep and rigorous, there is a polemical point that she's trying to make in this book, but she's making it in her own gentle, understated, scholarly way. That is really the fifth and last thought, fifth and last reason, among the last reasons and the major reasons to welcome her book, is that it is not consumed by despair and cynicism. Someone like me who has known Bangalore even longer than Girish has, will say, it's all going to pot. You can't walk in Common Park anymore. You can't cross the road. Even the KSC has to build a cricket stadium 40 miles away. You can't play in RSI anymore. That's the kind of lament. All the old bungalows are going. Victoria Hotel has gone. Anand Bhavan has gone. Atara Kacheri is all that's left. So this is a kind of narrative of lament that, if I may lapse into what really is my first Indian language, Hindi, sab barbad ho gaya. You know. Now, Harini challenges that. I mean, Harini's book is actually, I'm sure part of it is deliberate. Part of it is based on what she found. Because she finds vivid examples of nature persisting. Not only does Harini write about these carefully tended home gardens, but she talks about the spaces that remain. She has a wonderful account of a lake that was saved and restored in southern Bangalore by civic action. She talks about the fact that even in extremely densely populated and disadvantaged slum communities, there is the love of trees, both for aesthetic and utilitarian reasons, both for their beauty and what they may provide by way of fruit or medicinal plants and so on. So this is a book that is not consumed by despair and cynicism. It's an important reason to welcome it. She finds much reason for hope in the prevalence of citizens' activism, and perhaps even more than citizens' activism, in the stubborn persistence of an interest, understanding, and love for natural diversity in many of the city's residents, including, and perhaps even especially, in its poorer and more vulnerable residents. So it's a very important book. I've given you multiple reasons. Others will give you even more reasons. But I'll end with a thought. I think I praised Harini's reluctance to get into controversy. But I think that's a mark of a scholar. But I think sometimes scholars err to the other extreme. Maybe Girish and I are too much in the public eye. You know, we like making trouble and we like people talking about the trouble we make. Now that may be one extreme. But I think scientists sometimes, and Harini is not guilty of this because, as I shall explain, she writes in newspapers, but I think scientists need to do much more to make the results of their research available to a much wider spectrum. The first step is to write a book like this. I'm a historian, fortunately, and historians are known even in the academy by the books they write. But ecologists, which is what she was by training, physicists, economists, anthropologists, political scientists are known by the papers they publish in peer-reviewed journals. So the first transgression is to publish a book because your snooty peers will say you're dumbing down. Because you're not supposed to write anything which non-scientists understand. But one must go beyond that. And especially our work as important as this. So I hope there's a Kannada edition coming out. Fabulous. And I think maybe a children's edition coming out. There has to be a way in which the results of this research influence politicians and civil servants. And also entrepreneurs and industrialists. I mean, there have been several commissions and vision documents and vision committees appointed by different chief ministers. I don't think a single one has had an ecologist. I mean, Harini should be right there. Before the chaps who are listed on the NASDAQ stock exchange, she should be there. Because I think she understands much more about the city than them. They can write a check for her to use, that's different. Right. Now, I think it must reach all of them. Now, and of course, one of the most appealing figures in this book is Hyder Ali. Because of his sensitivity to nature, landscape, lakes, trees, and we need a 21st century Hyder Ali too. That should be one ultimate aim of this book, is to create, I say, not a brutal authoritarian Hyder Ali, but a person with that kind of understanding of what natural landscapes mean. This book, for all the reasons enumerated and other reasons I've not stated, is a model of its kind. I am certain it will spur and encourage other scholars and writers to turn the ecological gaze inwards, away from the countryside and towards the city. I mean, you will have nature in the city, works of this kind. I mean, this will really set a template for studies of our large and complex and internally diverse cities. And I would commend Oxford University Press for publishing it, and I will urge them to look for, it won't be easy to find Harini clones in Hyderabad and Chennai and everywhere else, but there's no harm in trying. And maybe some of her students can go out and go away from Bangalore and find ways of consolidating both the scholarly as well as social importance of this wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We now have the lady of the moment, Dr. Harini Nagendra, who will come and share her experience of writing this book. Please tell us more about it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming on a Friday evening. And thank you very much, Girish and Ram, for these very warm introductions to the book and for doing the honors to launch this. Ram is right when he says that this is a book that is meant to be very positive about the city. And I think just the numbers of people who have turned up here in this evening during a monsoon rainy season shows how much the interest in Bangalore is thriving. So I'm very, very thankful to all of you for being here. I'll start with something that I found very fascinating. And I think the day that I got it, I in fact emailed Ram, and it was his idea that I should make this the epigraph for the book, which is the Shiva Bharat of Bangalore. In the 1630s, Shivaji's father, took over Bangalore for a brief period. And his court poet, Parmanand, later wrote the Shiv Bharat, which is sort of a eulogy of Shaji and his exploits. And in this, he talks about Bangalore, which is probably the earliest written description of the city of Bangalore, which we have from somewhere around the 1630s, 1640s. And these are some sections from the book. He calls it Bingrul. And he says that matchless city with smart fortifications and towers resounded with content coos of countless pigeons safe in their nests. Animated by the calls of peafowl dashing in and out of skylights, the city teemed with deep lakes. Each house was graced by a well. Fountains gurgled at every square, spouting a fine mist. Trees thick with flowers and shade lined each home garden. Girdled by a bottomless moat glimmering with water and dotted with countless lakes, each as big as a sea. Picturesque parks festooned with creepers swinging gaily in the breeze, all adorned the city. Shaji ruled here like Indra in his paradise, enjoying every sport and pastime with his kinsfolk. And what a beautiful city that must have been at that time. And still in parts of it, in reflections of it, you can still see that the structure of the city has largely remained the same, with its lakes, its parks, its home gardens, and people living in the midst of all of these. The one thing we seem to have lost is the peafowl, but apart from that, I think we have quite a bit of it. So from this is where I want to take you into nature and the city, and this was my first interest in the history of the city. I am from Bangalore, and as Ram said, I'm also an ecologist, and ecologists normally do study distant forests, and I am guilty of that as well, and I've been doing that from 93 onwards. And sometime in 2006, a number of different things happened between 2006 and 2008. First, I returned back to the city after some time out, and though it was 2-3 years out of Bangalore, I was struck by the changes in the city and how much it had transformed before my eyes. I was also becoming somewhat disillusioned with working in distant forests where policy relevance of one's work or the way of communicating one's work to people, because you don't live in those places. You come in and fly in or take the train in and then work on these forests and come out. And so wanted to do something more in my backyard, so to speak, looking at where I lived and where hopefully one could make a difference. We had also purchased land and built a house on the outskirts of the city. And when I started going to nurseries to get my home garden, which I thought would be the same as that of my aunts and my mother, the kind of garden that Ram described, I found to my horror that you don't get those kinds of plants anymore because the kinds of people that the nurseries were supplying were somewhat different. And then my daughter was born in the end of 2007, and I started thinking about what kind of a city we were leaving behind for her. With all of this together, basically crystallized the seeds of this work to say, let's start looking at the city. And it turned out to be an important issue because if you look at, so this is a nightlight satellite picture of Bangalore, of India. And you can see how much the country is lit up with lights even at night. And this tells you just how all-pervasive our urban footprint has become. And when we're thinking of a country like this, what is the scope for nature and the future of nature in such a country? Because the cities, though they might not be very large in terms of their total size, have a footprint that is well beyond them. They spread to distant countrysides, they suck out water from places, send their waste to other places, get their fruit from everywhere else. If we can't have an ethic of nature conservation in our cities, there is really no hope for nature conservation outside. And for children like my daughter growing up in cities, most of, or at least a majority of India's children will now grow up in its cities. And if they don't see nature and experience it, why are they going to have a conservation ethic? Why will they care about nature? And then what is the future of the world going to be 20, 30 years from now? So with this, I started looking at nature in Bangalore around 2006. And I started with the conventional view. And in this beautiful figure here, which is by a good friend of mine, Sudhira, when we were working together on the city, this is the sort of what we think of as the growth of the city. Kempegowda came in 1537, created the market town, and then it grew from there, leaps and bounds after a while, to become the large city that it is. But when Kempegowda came in 1537, he did not come to a land that was devoid of human habitation. He did not create this market town de novo because of an idea that just suddenly occurred to him out of nowhere. That is indeed part of the popular myth, but there's a lot of archaeological and inscriptional evidence that shows that the city was or the landscape around the city was well populated a long time ago. So there's evidence for it to be a flourishing trade route sometime around between the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD. Later, from the 5th, 6th century onwards, we start getting these inscriptional evidence that is available on copper plates, on stones. And if you start looking at that, before Kempegowda came in, there were 4 major dynasties here: the Gangas, the Cholas, the Hoysalas, and then the Vijayanagara Empire, which he became part of. If you look at the landscape of Bangalore around this, and this is a topographic map of Bangalore. So the undulations that you see, if you look at the west side, there is what they call the Malnad, or the rolling hills. These are where the granite outcrops are and things are a little more rocky. And on the eastern side, you have what you call the Maidan or the Bailu in Kannada. And the Bailu or the Maidan is the rolling grassy plains where you have more water, less of a slope. It's more conducive for pasture, whereas the Malnad area is more rocky. That's where you had the cows and the grazing in the rocky sort of jungle, what they call the jungle in those days. So if you look at the 6th to 9th centuries CE, when you had the Ganga dynasty, you'll see that people preferred to settle in the areas that were easier to settle in, which was the Maidan. And you had villages around these areas. And from here onwards, you start seeing inscriptions talking about the lakes in the city. And so one thing which is very interesting with Bangalore is it's an old settled city which is not next to a coast and it's not next to a large river. That's unusual. Where does it get its water from? Well, it creates its water, so to speak, through rainwater harvesting. What it had was small rivulets and streams, and in these inscriptions, you actually record people clearing the jungle, digging out the sand, building a lake, and then growing paddy downstream, and then creating a temple and using this paddy to the service of the gods. And that's how these lakes were created, and around them, settlements were created. And so this is the Ganga dynasty. Then from the Chola dynasty onwards, they start moving slightly more west and into the areas of the Malnad. By the time of the Hoysalas in the 13th to 14th centuries, the Hoysalas are great tank builders. So they build lakes across this entire area. And if you look at all the names that you know of in Bangalore ending with Sandra, Singa Sandra, Malla Sandra, Junnu Sandra, Sandra means Samudra. And Samudra, what does it mean? A large body of water. So all of these areas with the name Sandra were areas that used to have water. You can look at some of the other names in here, and the maps in the book are more clear. And there are Kunte and, so Kere, Kundi, all of these are bodies of water. And so now you can see the Hoysalas learned how to exploit this landscape, and they move further and further into the Malnad. And so the entire landscape around Bangalore starts filling up. And from the 14th to 16th centuries, before Kempegowda, of course, the landscape continues to have villages. And I've stopped where Kempegowda came in at the time where Kempegowda came in. But already in this time, in these 4 periods with 4 different dynasties coming in, there are 75 villages within and around this landscape of Bangalore. So if you look at the landscape of Bangalore right now and 10 kilometers surrounding it, 75 flourishing villages, a trade network, rice that was grown, all kinds of other things. So he did come in and create this market landscape, but in a place that was conducive of this. And indeed, when he created his landscape, the Vijayanagara king was so pleased with him that he granted him 12 villages around this area as Jagir. One of them very close to where I live in Sarjapur Road, which is Dodkanalli. And it was, I know people who are here who are from around the place. So yes, that was given as a Jagir in 1537 to Kempegowda. And today, unfortunately, this is a picture of Bangalore from today and the lakes and the lake networks that we have. We have 3 watersheds with different networks of lakes. But today, planners and builders do not consider what was obvious to people centuries ago. The fact that there was topography, there was ecology, and that shaped the nature of what you see. The Malnad and the Maidan were very different in terms of their activity. So the Malnad had pastoralism, it had what you call Veerakallus around these areas, which are hero stones which document wildlife and people dying in battle and what they call, so these heroic battles that they described were really between different pastoral groups that were raiding each other. And then in the eastern side, in the Maidan or the Bailu, you have a very different landscape with a different kind of agriculture that you practice, which is more rice-based and less pastoralism. Now we've forgotten this, right? You have a wet marshland, you grow eucalyptus and acacia for a few years, you fill it in with a lot of debris and you can construct apartments. You have an area with granite, rocky outcrops, you blast that down and you can construct apartments. Except that the city, it's not so easy because the nature does have its last laugh and the city suffers in times of, for instance, drought, when you have our bowels running dry and areas where you should not have built to the extent that you do, running out of water. And other areas, what we call low-lying areas, which are nothing but lakes that should not have been built on, which get flooded in times of rain. And this is something one can even see in the case of, for instance, Sampangiri Lake, which is now the Kantirva Stadium, which got flooded a year and a half ago, and they had to suck out all the water, and which just seems, so we have really forgotten this whole idea of change. But another thing, if you look at what happens from then on, from 1791, we have then the first maps of the city. So we don't have much in terms of, we have a lot of myth and legend and stories about Kempegowda's time, but really not much that is well documented that you can trace. And then you have, of course, this lovely poem by Parmanand about Shahji's, the Bangalore of Shahji's times. Then in 1791, in the Third Anglo-Mysore War, the British take over Bangalore for a while, for about 18 months, and you have maps from then. And from then onwards, you can start to chart changes. And what I want to show you is a series of maps from 1791 to 1888 to 2015. And I want you to note 2 things. That over time, as the number of people grow and the city grows, lakes decrease and trees increase. And this is very interesting, and I'll come back to why, some of the possible reasons why. So look at 1791. I've marked the area as the cantonment. Of course, there is no such thing as the cantonment at that point of time, but this is just refers to the areas that later become the cantonment, where we have information about. Now you can see that this is a semi-arid landscape, which is what Bangalore is in the middle of, and you didn't have too many trees in this area. You had you had these groups of trees which are orchards. You have some around the Pete, of course, which was the area that provided cover for, and fortified the Pete from attacks. And you also have lakes, of course, everywhere around the place, and a few trees along major roadsides. By 1888, you start having a lot more lakes in the city because there are more people. You need to give them water. And so they've built a lot of lakes to give water. But they also start running out of water. There's too many people in the city and they can't supply it only with water from the lakes. They also, records from the British archives around 1830s, 1840s start talking about the fact that there are too many people and the city is getting very hot. And therefore, you don't need fireplaces in the city. They say, sepoys couldn't fire their muskets in the morning because their fingers were so benumbed with the cold. And that doesn't happen these days because Bangalore is so hot. And this is the 1840s. And therefore, they start planting trees to cool down the city. And they select these beautiful giant trees, rain trees and these other large giants, and they start planting them in the area. By 2015, you can see a lot of trees. Of course, you'll see a lot fewer than there were in 2005, because I think around the early 2000s marks the period of large-scale tree felling. But nevertheless, from the 1880s to 2015, we have planted a lot of trees. And we have lost almost all of our lakes. Even Alsur Lake, which you can see in the center of this image, I'll show you Alsur Lake in 1888. and it was double the size, and it's only half now. Now, why is this? Less lakes and more trees. It's interesting. It's our dependence on nature. And what happens in about 1893 to 1898 is we start running out of water, and there are droughts in the city, and people start realizing that it cannot depend on its lakes anymore, and they start getting piped water from outside, from the Arkavati project, from Hesarghata. And then this continues, and you can quickly see a change in the narrative in the archives at that point, because they start now talking about lakes, which were sacred, life-giving spaces that people worshipped, as places which are sources of malaria. Wells are polluting, and you get diseases from these places, and they're noxious, and they should be just filled in. And that's what they steadily start doing. Whereas trees, you use trees in a lot of different ways. And then people start needing shade, and therefore you start getting more and more trees in the city. And so it's a very different narrative of when you localize nature, when you draw your resources from it, you depend on it and you conserve it. When you get it from somewhere far away, it's replaceable. If you don't get water from Hesarghata, you can get water from distant places in the Kaveri. If not from there, you can get it from another river, right? But your trees and your shade and your food, you need from the trees next door. The second thing you get is a shift in the value of nature over time. What you see is, though, that we used to have a multifunctional appreciation of nature, and we go to a very recreational and utilitarian view of nature. And so a lake is a good example, for instance, and the lakes, we used to use them for washing and watering livestock. They used to support livelihoods. People used to collect greens from the bed. But our lakes today are very different. Most cases, they're polluted, and in the cases that they are restored, they're largely restored for recreation and for nature watching. The city had its famous Gundutops, which were these wooded village forests around the place, which had jackfruit and mango, which people used to survive on. They have been either degraded or converted into public utilities, or in the few places that they have been restored, again, it's the same trend. They converted to gated parks, and they're largely recreational. And most of you must have seen these parks with large do nots, right? Do not pluck flowers, do not pluck leaves, do not, so our lakes are pretty similar. You have the list of do nots are so huge that you can't really use them in multiple ways as people used to. Our streets, similarly, we lose our dependence. So this is a photograph which is of one of my favorite, what used to be one of my favorite roads, KR Road. And when we shifted to JP Nagar in the 80s, KR Road was a beautiful road with a lot of trees. And this is from KR Road when it was built. So in the 1930s or so, it had banyan trees on both sides, and it had this very vibrant street life and a lot of street vendors. Bamboo vendors actually were very famous. All of you who are old Bangaloreans would know the bamboo vendors on KR Road and maybe have bought things from them. Now, of course, because of various projects, it's become a high-speed road with few trees. But as I document in the book, this loss of trees has meant a loss of an entire way of life for the street vendors. It's not just the public spaces that have experienced this loss of multifunctional nature. It's also private spaces. So you had rich home gardens, and I won't talk about this much because Ram read out the passage from the book, but these were gardens that were used in so many ways. But many of these are now getting converted into apartments which have a focus on manicured lawns and ornamental plants only. And this is where I found, I struck it very dry when I was trying to look for plants for our house and could not find the plants that I wanted, because I got all these variegated plants that, require a lot of spraying and maintaining. And they said, Nimanta or yaar barallama, nobody like you comes and asks us for these plants anymore. But it's interesting, slums, which is probably unexpected, but it's one of the last refuges where you find multifunctional nature thriving and thriving. Slums, of all the land use categories we looked at, had the highest proportion of local species and the highest proportion of what we call used species or useful species. And they were used for a variety of things. Of course, for cooking and for food, because they're very valuable as nutritional supplements. But one of the ladies in the slum that I went to, and next to a polluted lake, lives next to a filthy well. Getting water is so hard, and then she has this lovely patch of little garden with even plants like aloe vera. And I said, why do you have aloe vera? And she said, my daughter had planted it. She got married a year ago, but I still water it in her memory. And then, while thinking of her. And she said, Nimmanthavaru parlorige hogtare, Nammantavaru idu upyogistare, which is people like you go to the parlor, but for people like us, this aloe vera is our parlor. And then you think of the multiple things that nature mean when you have so little. They grow plants in old paint buckets and leaky utensils. So this is one of the places that nature still thrives. Sacred spaces are also extremely resilient. And this is from the beautiful temple in Malleshwaram where you have the spring of water that comes out through the Nandi, and this is a pigeon drinking it, and this is a lovely photo that one of my students had taken. And so sacred spaces are so resilient across Bangalore, and in every place, in mosques, in our churches, in our temples, in our cemeteries of various kinds, you have these giant trees. So many of our sacred practices, all our religions consider nature as sacred. And therefore, you have these practices such as feeding ants and birds or protecting monkeys that are, continue across the city. So to wrap up, and there's a lot of detail, obviously, which I'm not going to cover in this, but is in the book. But nature in Bangalore has really witnessed centuries of change. It was once a brown and dusty place which became blue because of its lakes and became green because of its trees. And now is turning gray because of its concrete, which is slowly swallowing up everything else that we have. In this process, what seems to be happening is we had an organic connection with nature in the city. And that seems to be getting disrupted, leading to all the degradation and decay that we see around us, because we don't relate to nature the same way. When you don't use it in multiple ways, and you only think of it as recreation. Recreation is replaceable, right? You can go to a mall for recreation, or you can go to a gym for exercise. But when you use nature in multiple ways, that's when you want to preserve it. So nature, where it survives and where it thrives, is places which are commons, which are managed by communities, places like slums, like lakes, that like sacred places, where people come together to protect nature. And that, I think, is really the way forward for our city. So where I've ended the book is talking about multiple narratives of this kind, multiple wonderful places like the Kaikondrelli Lake or a little park in Jayanagar, where people have got together and protected their places, little havens of nature, and managed to make them thrive. And this is what our path is forward to the future. I'll just end with acknowledgements. Firstly, to my long-suffering family, I should say, and my daughter, who's 8.5, who spent 2 years tolerating her mother's absorption in the book, and my husband and mother and sister and everyone. I think I've practically spent several months doing nothing but dreaming of writing this book and talking of the book. Funding support from a number of generous research agencies, research support from a number of wonderful students and collaborators, many of whom are in this room, and of course the people of Bangalore. And this is a tribute to this wonderful city, really, that the kinds of things that we have done, we've gone into people's homes and said we want to study insects at night. Here's a large light trap, and it looks like this scary box with lights. We're just going to tell you it's a black box. We're going to put it in your garden for 9 hours. And these are complete strangers because we select random samples. We ask you to open your window a crack at night so we can put a wire through it and keep this light burning for 8 hours. Practically nobody turned us away. I mean, you would think that in a city of today where, terrorism and robbery and all of these threats are there, everybody welcomed us in for all of our surveys. People spend their time talking to us. People let us do our surveys. And so this book is really a thank you and a tribute to all the people of Bangalore, without which this research would not have been possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Harini. We now open the floor for questions.
Do you want to give her a mic? I think you could speak. It should be fine. Yeah, you could.
I'm happy to hear you and other people on this. What I would like to know is you highlighted a lot of issues of Bangalore. What's your agenda behind this? Will you be going to government offices and trying to address the issues which already they are aware of, or any action, any positive action which can transform change? Because there's so many good things happening, so many research happening, so many good books are coming. Finally, it just goes in reading, and they read and they blame, and some people will blame, some people will read, and they'll be just forgotten after that. So can there be some actual action taken so that we can work towards it as practical?
Definitely, and thank you. That's a very important issue. But this book is really part of that larger process, which is something I think our work started with. So for the past 10 years, we have been in touch with various people working on lakes, working on parks, working on the streets. Some efforts are more successful, some are less so. I think a lot of difference comes when people get together and can push for action. And really, where I see the hope for things forward is to work not directly with the government maybe, but with groups of citizens who then push the government to get things done. And I think that's probably why this book, and why also the idea of Kannada translation and writing for the newspapers is all of this, to work with people who are already doing things. Yes.
I belong to the present generation of Bangaloreans. It's been like 4 to 5 years I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a defense correspondent. I work, I only go from my home, Anki Tank, and reach Kabban Road all the time. What I see in the past 5 years, it's not the same when I came here. And by getting to know things here, what I remembered was Dharwad. Dharwad is very similar to Bangalore when it comes to nature, the lakes, the parks, the gardens, and even the wells for that matter. Mm-hmm. Dharwad has, every household had a well in the backyard. As of now, when I see Bangalore and when I compare that with Dharwad is the next Bangalore which I'm looking at. Many things are changing, malls are coming up, lakes are getting drained out, and one major lake, Unkal Lake, is already filled with a lot of stuff which you can't even make use of. What I see from this is it's not just a city, it's not just Bangalore which we are talking about. There are multiple cities,
Absolutely.
multiple urban places wherein we actually can conserve and actually build things on. So this can be a really good study factor for a lot of other cities or growing cities to actually work on. And urban spaces, I think, have to be more communicable with the people rather than disintegrated to only a certain set of people living there and having their livelihood done.
Absolutely, and that's very, one of the few things, for instance, we don't know enough about India's cities is what's happening outside, for instance, Mumbai, Calcutta, Delhi, Bangalore, Madras. We know nothing about the Dharwads or even the Punes or the Ahmedabads or the Surats or any of these other smaller places. And we have 3 of the world's 10 fastest growing cities. And we don't talk about them because we don't know what's happening in them. And so you're very right. The story of Dharwad is the story of what Bangalore maybe was a few years ago, and will be the story of, unfortunately, all these new towns and cities that are yet to be built unless we do something about them. And so this book is also a hope towards, to stimulate other conversations about other Indian cities, which we very urgently need. I have to find out. If you have ideas, let me know.
Hi. I really liked how you described Bangalore in terms of colors, from the red to the blue to the green to the grey. Do you think it is possible that it will ever return away from the grey back to the green and hopefully the blue?
I think it's definitely possible. What we need to be doing is an aggressive, for instance, tree planting agenda. We've cut so many trees, but it seems to be, we keep persistently hearing that the new approach of the government is to not plant trees on roads anymore because roads are apparently not the place for trees. So if you go in that direction, then you're not going to get any progress. But there's so much place for plantation that we really need to be doing something aggressive. And similarly for our lakes, now that they've been fenced and protected, we can do a lot, I think, to turn this back. We should be doing it.
Thank you.
Sridhar?
Meera Binder, environmental philosopher. So 2 questions. One is about the zoopolis. You've talked a lot about the trees, and in your experiences and in your research, what did you find, apart from the insects, which I know is a very rich biodiversity of insects, and the birds, which you've worked earlier on because of tree cover, this corn species, the kinds of goats and chickens and stuff that people have, and there's also this snakes. Snakes are still around in Bangalore, I know. So what experience of zoopolis did you have, of the zoological, of the fauna? The second question is a little more philosophical, if I may beg of the audience. The ethical stance of the people usually is a very personal relationship to my tree and my thing. Where did you find the shift going to our tree and our nature? Do you find that shift easy to, do people communicate that shift, or is it only about their little garden and their little piece of green? Where does the personal ethic become collective? If you could, if you from your experience or from your research, you could see how the personal ethic towards nature becomes a collective ethic. Because personally, I like my tree. It's in front of my house. But what happens to my neighbor's tree, the other tree, the tree in the thing? Because I know a large group of people are doing work, Hasiru and others. But in the people, the normal people in the slums or wherever you've gone to, where did you find the shift happening ethically?
So, firstly, with the zoopolis, a lot of my book is actually not about wildlife. There's some sections, especially in the history, but our own studies have not been on so much on wildlife. What we do have is a lot of accounts of people, and therefore we have some ideas of what kinds of wildlife have stayed and what have. So, some trends you see, for instance, amphibians. Frogs are the first to disappear, and we know that frogs are particularly sensitive. Snakes somehow seem to still survive and thrive. And so we have some discussion of this. Monkeys seem to be, apart from the sparrow, really endangered, because Bangalore was described as a metropolis of monkeys. And I also remember, even 20 years ago, how many monkeys there used to be, and they're really not there anymore. And so there you go. So a lot of changes in monkeys over time. But in terms of the others, it's an interesting question about environment. I think there's something, it's not just personal. What I've seen, and it relates to the evolution of Bangalore from villages, is that there's a lot of caring about trees and nature in your community. So, it could be your Gundutopu, it could be your Gaumala land, it could be your grazing, your so whatever you think of as an urban village, right? Your area. So your Jayanagar or your JP Nagar or your Baswangudi. Beyond that, you're right, it does break down. And I think one thing we've seen, for instance, in all these tree protest movements or anything else, people who come up to protest about a lake or a tree or a road, it's largely going to be from that neighborhood, because that's where you live and deal with these. But I don't think that's such a bad thing, because we have so many numbers of people in every neighborhood now that we should. But it's a question that needs a lot more research, definitely. Sridhar?
Harini, we have spoken often about many lakes and specific issues regarding Bangalore. And I just glanced through the chapter on envisioning a future, an inclusive future for an urban nature in Bangalore. The question that comes to me is, while Bangaloreans are much more caring towards the nature, and this I'm saying as a Bangalorean when I've seen how people relate to it, be it my mom, my neighbors, everybody, right? But what doesn't explain to me is about 450 mld of sewage that flows into Bellandur Lake, or 300 mld, right? Depending on whom you trust the numbers with. Or when you look at what Bellandur itself has become, I'm taking it as an example of a lake because it's the largest lake. It's become KADB to some extent to provide land in its wetland for industrialization. It's providing sewage treatment of BWSSB. Where will we end this kind of mindless development? And you have pointed very, very beautiful shoots of growth about collective action, about doing enough of how ESG and Civic and all these PILs have brought in a lot of action. But is it enough with the pace at which Bangalore is urbanizing? And how do we reclaim our city? Right? When we see so much, the problems running at 1,000 kilometers an hour and our ability to catch up with it is at 1 kilometer an hour, right? So sorry, I mean, it's a very hopeful book, but I just wanted to see, how do you see it as a researcher?
I see the challenges and I see them all, and as you know, I mean, we've all been dealing with this and breaking our heads and looking at all the frustrations day to day. But I can't not be hopeful. Partly that's my nature, maybe I'm optimistic, and but partly where do we go from here? If we're all going to be pessimistic and give up, we have to live in the city or somewhere and make that somewhere a better place. So I think we have no choice but to break our heads against this. The larger forces, which are the economic forces, which are the real estate forces, which are things that we struggle with, corruption, all of those, are there. And yes, so I don't want to make it seem like this, it's very simple. Let's all just get together and sing the song and then, things will transform. It's not that. But we must find ways of doing things. And I think the few stories that we have, the few successes that we see, tell you that change is possible and for which we have to be hopeful.
I mean, one related thing is the recent National Green Tribunal order that we got.
Absolutely,
on
which you
the-
got from for the Belundur wetland,
That's right,
Agra
yeah.
Bandar, which is a way forward not just for that particular wetland but for all wetlands across the country.
Absolutely.
So
And I'd just like to use your platform to just request everyone to go through this beautiful short order from the National Green Tribunal on the lake protection, protecting the nerves that connect our lakes, which is the stormwater drains. This is the order that made the buffer increase from 30 meters to 75 meters, right? So if you could all collectively come together, and we have my colleagues there out there, if you could just sign in and suggest how we would like to be part of this larger reclaiming process, right? And that will help us to collectively push together this order, right? And until unless we come back to focus on our lakes,
absolutely,
our water
no,
security is,
yes,
is definitely
true. And this is a very, very important effort. In fact, they do have the pamphlets out there, so please do pick up copies. And now one question my daughter has been waiting to ask, so yes.
Where does nature thrive and how? How do people protect it?
You protect it when you care about it, like you care about it.
Like how? Like what do they do to protect it?
They plant a tree, they put some manure on the tree, they don't throw away their waste, they don't create garbage, they grow the tree and they use the tree. Children climb in it, play in it and swing in it and eat its fruits. Yes.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you. And I have not yet gone through your book, but I have heard the comments and also critically gone through. But one thing with your presentation and the comments from the dignitaries, what I find is you have traced beautifully the history. But the plant history, as I see, as a botanist, today what we see as a garden city in Bangalore, right from Hyder Ali's time and Tipu Sultan's time, has totally been changed. Nearly 80 to 90% of the flora that we find here in Bangalore,
Absolutely.
the tree flora especially,
Yes.
entirely exotic.
Yes.
And naturally, the corresponding faunal thing also have been changing. And with the changing nature of the city from last 2 decades, I can say, how we think we can bring back the original nature of the nativity of the species and also maintaining its diversity for its, the name of the city as a garden city. Both have to go together and how we can work towards that. That's what just you may have some reflection on that and may like to include it. Thank you.
Thank you. These are very important comments. And yes, of course, I mean, I think as your own work has also shown that there's a lot of change, I think, in the botanical composition. I do talk about these, for instance, if you look at streets, the kind of Indian ethic of the plants, the trees we planted. Of course, there were things like mango and jackfruit and tamarind and ficus, which we planted for the shade, but also for the fact that they gave us fruits. But apart from fruits, we also had this different aesthetic of smell. We planted trees that did not necessarily look so beautiful in terms of flowers, but smelt beautiful. And the British have a very different ethic, different aesthetic, of looking at trees. And what they choose to plant is showy and flowery and spectacular blossoms, which of course have, they've also been here for 200 years plus, and many of the birds and butterflies and other insects have grown naturalized and used to them. But in terms of looking at how do we get these traditional species back, tamarind and mango and jackfruit and ficus trees back on our streets, back in our lakes, and can we do away with planting silver oaks and eucalyptus and acacia everywhere? We really need to start looking at this in much more detail. And maybe come up with, for instance, tree planting guides, now that there are so many citizen efforts on plantation of trees, and work with our nurseries to do things. So there's much that we need to do in this direction. Exactly, right. ways, because now you see a lot of private real estate players advertising butterfly gardens and private lakes as a selling point for buying place. So you have both ends of it. But yes, when it's a commodity, you can fill in this lake and create another private lake somewhere else, or you can fill in this park and do something else somewhere and create a terrace garden, and it's seemingly all equalizable. And that's the danger with commodification, right? It's replaceable. You can get water from here, you can get the experience maybe of watching a wild animal through a YouTube video. Why do you need wild animals in the city? Or you can go out on the weekend and see a forest. So that is the path that we somehow seem to be heading down towards. Yes, and yes. You don't know where it's come from, and you don't know who's feeling the negative effects, right? Because, I think for me, it's just very personal, but my interest in composting started when I went and saw the waste dumps in Mandur. And if you go and see what you're doing to somebody, that's when you realize what you've been doing and what you get away with in the city. And we get away with a lot of things in the city that we should not be.